If I had read Sabriel when I was but a wee lad, probably in the age of like 10 to 13, right around the time I became the most into his dark materials I ever was, it would have rocketed to the top of my fantasy list. This is prime for young fantasy readers who are just getting into it and probably just getting old enough to like understand quality writing to truly become obsessed with science fiction and fantasy. I have not read Garth Nix before. This is my first exposure to him as a writer, and I've been told like he's one of the fantasy authors whose pen game is off the charts, but I wasn't expecting this refined, this honed in on coming across exactly as intended to an audience. I mean, I just got done reading The Wandering Inn, Volume 1, which I think is like near 400,000 words.
You're wrong.
Of sloppy, charming, but sloppy execution of a story I've been told gets way more refined as the millions of words go on. But Sabriel out the gate hits like a prime athlete who is just and reach that peak performance, steps into a ring, and delivers a masterclass of a takedown. I mean, this is that old school style of storytelling in the fantasy genre, where the author is a master of their craft and understands how to tell a good story on a technical level and benefits from it so that we can have outstanding characterization that hyper motivates everything at all times. I found myself thinking of Joe Abercrombie's writing a lot while reading this, which I don't know if there's a lot of influence there, and I understand totally, completely different, but it's this personality sizzle that infects both series where there's a type of characterization that if you like one, I think that specific style of snarky, intelligent, quippy characterization will come across clearly in both. Taking place in a world that feels like a combination of Alice in Wonderland, maybe a little bit of his Dark Materials, a touch of Middle-earth, like it's such a different fantasy world from 1995 when this came out than I've personally come across from that era. Man, I feel like I've been missing out. Garth Nix fucks. And just getting like the book blurb pitch out of the way so we can avoid spoilers, but you understand the kind of story I'm talking about. Sabriel is a student in a boarding school and a part of a special line. This is a royalty type story. She is exposed to different kinds of magic, but the central focus what are we talking about for the main conflict is magic around the deady boys. But it's not as simple as straightforward necromancy and not treated exactly the same within society, though there are necromantic threats that are treated that way. When her father goes missing, Sabriel receives a mission, something she must do to prevent apocalyptic level type things happening. But the story starts really small scale, very personal to Sabriel, and the motivation for us as a reader to become more and more attached to Sabriel as a protagonist is how much she is required to step up to the plate despite loss and hardship. There is a substantial amount of growth in this character that feels earned and believable. Someone who goes from feeling a bit more childish to being able to stand up in a dramatic confrontation at the end and believably, as the reader, take the wheel and finish off the story, keeping it spoiler free. And thematically, that kind of continues to permeate the book from beginning to end. It is a book about growing up, about taking on responsibility, and what it really means to shoulder that while you're grieving. I mean, life isn't fair, and I'm saying all of this, and remember, this is kind of marketed as like, not like YA has such a loaded term to it now, but like a youth fantasy is what I'll say. In the marketing, it says 12 plus, so there you go. I will say specifically, if you are going into Sabriel, whatever, and expecting what you get today in modern YA, you could be a little disappointed. I'm not trying to say that YA isn't a very diverse genre. It certainly is probably more diverse now than ever in terms of the types of stories you can find. But mainstream YA tends to follow a bit of a pattern. There's an underdog rebellion that a young protagonist who could be an orphan or abused joins to upset the status quo. Sabriel is aggressively trying to work for the establishment. She is a part of a lineage, a long line of people whose job it is to keep things as they are and protect people, which is great. It's just not the proven moneymaker formula that I think a lot of people expect from their mainstream big author YA endeavors today. Even in the world building, it's definitely pre the Harry Potter boom. There's a reason I'm comparing it to His Dark Materials and not A Sorcerer's Stone. The world feels far more Middle-earth. I mean, kind of tying that all in together, no, she's not trying to dismantle the power system, and instead, she's going up against a big bad guy whose presence is growing in power and suddenly going to resurge in a big bad way, if that sounds familiar. I often found myself also thinking of like the Flight books, if you remember those when I was like reading this. I'm kind of nostalgic for this era of YA fantasy. I miss it in some ways. But it's so technically well done and does have so much going on in terms of its ideas and character work and world building that anyone of any age will absolutely appreciate what's happening. And that is just like a fine wine that's appropriate for non-alcoholic underage drinkers. I mean, this comes together in a world that has tanks, yet definitely feels high fantasy. People fly around on like massive paper planes, but there's also a reference to hockey. It's complicated. It does absolutely transport you to another world, but feels strangely grounded. And this is maintained through also symbolic references that are linked back to our own religions and mythologies as well, which is an angle of world building within fantasy that I'm particularly really partial to. I love seeing superstitions or things from our world become reality in other fantasy worlds. Like the dead hesitate to cross like aggressive bodies of water. They don't want to run across them. Think of like the Ringwraith scene from Lord of the Rings. It's like that, but it's like a fact. And I don't know, there's something about that vividness tied into characterization too as well. I mean, these kinds of beliefs and superstitions affect some of the main core cast and crew. And besides Sabriel, we also have a really charming character. Highly recommend the audiobook because it's voiced by Tim Curry, and he was born to play, I think, the second major character introduced, Mogget, a snarky small white cat that is very, like, not totally Cheshire Cat, but kind of personality in that similar snark vibe. And a lot of the times, like, characters that embody that mischievous tone can be neglected by wider narratives. That is absolutely not the case here. It's not a cheap, like, nudge character, and instead, there's actually great reason and justification, in hindsight, looking back after finishing the book, for, like, everything that came into play for Maggot. For Magut, however you say this name. I don't even trust narrators anymore, because the amount of times that I've said a word or name like a narrator does, and then the fans are like, actually, you're wrong, and here's a quote from the author saying you're wrong. How am I supposed to do my goddamn job anymore? But like, that actually takes me back to talking about this tone, because as you can probably tell with mentions of things like tanks, there's war, there's tension, grand conflict, but with like paper airplanes that fly people, there's whimsy, there's joy in Sabriel. And I'd say overall, there's kind of like a dull, sinister edge that, again, I want to pull to His Dark Materials, functions very well here. Because like in His Dark Materials, despite it being for kids, there's the gobblers, right? There's the people who are kidnapping children. And so even for young readers, there's that tension. Oh, that sinister vibe that permeates every chapter. And I feel like that's accomplished here as well with the work that happens with like necromantic powers and seeing that some of the people really close to Sabriel can't exactly be trusted, but have to be close due to supernatural circumstance. It manages to be both playful yet creepy, dense and light, which takes me to Touchstone. Not a touchstone for the story, a character called Touchstone. And there is a spark of romance to be had in Sabriel. It's very, again, I don't know why I'm pulling so much from His Dark Materials, but it's an apt comparison. Will and Lyra. We have Sabriel and Touchstone. And they're young characters who, you know, grow and hesitant at first conflict and eventually start liking each other. And it's that young teen love that I think is just kind of wholesome and sweet to experience in a lot of different narratives. And it's not the greatest romance I've come across, but if I was a young fantasy reader, it's the exact kind that would like addict me to the page, because I would, oh my gosh, there's a little romance happening. When you're a really young kid, despite trying to be like a macho teen, you're gonna fucking love that. I don't know, maybe that's just me, but when I was like a young fantasy reader, I'd always be embarrassed how much I ended up liking romance. As an adult now, I'm just gonna say it proudly. I love romance in my books. Give me that. I mean, it's not the best romance ever, but even the attraction between them is handled with tact and care. Garth Nix is not creepy at any point, and instead just realizes what young teens feel toward each other, and that's great. But what I like more even outside of that is their chemistry as two companions traveling together. There is a heap load of motivation and backstory given to Touchstone, Garth Nix as an author. It's just very little fat. Everything here is meat. There is reason and purpose to so much, to the point where I started dismissing things, being like, that collar's not going to be important. And then, oh, lo and behold, egg on my face, totally wrong. I guess I'm just used to reading a lot of authors who are okay with like fatty stories, which is not inherently wrong. If you like a story that's just going to meander and wander, that's fine. But Sabriel is the definition of lean. If I have one criticism, maybe Sabriel as a story could have benefited from staying a bit more personal stakes. I kind of believe that. I don't know if I really want to put my whole chest into that criticism, but it kind of has this build to the stakes. And by the end of it, the main conflict seemed a little bit too large for the emotion I'm having for Sabriel in that moment. I felt like if it was kept a tiny bit smaller, the realization of her being able to like overcome youth and grow into this responsibility could have been a bit more relatable, because where it ends up is so large that it's kind of like, oh, you couldn't have grown to that. Like that's too big. Like, great that you're handling it, but holy. But maybe in a story that's so much about personal hardship and growth, that's only appropriate, that something in a fantastical world reaches to that fantastical extent. And we get to see our protagonist step up to the plate after going through so much. Two additional things I want to mention in this section. One, this is pre-Sanderson. This is pre-hard magic being popular. If magic just working in a story because it's the right time for a story beat to happen, so the magic's going to do a thing, bothers you, it's going to bother you here. And two, I hyped up the relationship between Sabriel and Touchstone, and I do like it quite a bit, but there is also a little bit of they're young and they're just together now. But there's also some time jumpage going on. Either way, it's not perfect, but I still really liked it. I don't want you to think that like the characters are like bubbling over with personality. That's not what I'm trying to say. And instead, I would say Sabriel is insecure. I would say that results in her feeling more reserved to a lot of the people around her and to the reader. But if you're paying attention, it's Garth Nix intentionally doing that to make a character who feels a bit insecure, though determined to move forward despite how much is being put on them. It ties into the themes. Whereas in, a lot of more modern endeavors into YA, it's about the strength of, inside yourself, and, there's going to be that I'm going to punch the evil bad guy right in the face. We don't get that. But that more controlled personality is used just as effectively scene to scene. But the one thing I haven't touched on is where does the gut punch land? And hell yeah. There's a father-daughter dynamic that echoes in the background throughout this, right? From the beginning, I said, setting up the story, you can tell a father-daughter dynamic is distant. He's off, the mission's given, and he's possibly gone forever. And so it's about Sabriel trying to get to where he could be and fulfill a mission. I hate not spoiling stuff. And when that echo finally manages to come on down and resonate in the actual scenes that are happening towards the climax, well done. And if you read it, you'll know why I chose those words. Not tears, but goosebumps all over. And the time element that's introduced could be cheap, but the way it's executed was just heartbreaking because, to quote one of my favorite lines from fantasy ever, duty is heavier than a mountain, death lighter than a feather. But Garth Nix kind of is saying no to that. And Sabriel to me feels like a book that it straight up says absolutely not. Death is not as light as a feather. When it comes to self, maybe, but when it comes to others, it is one of the most complex and difficult things to realize. And at the end of the day, you really just hope you're able to say goodbye. I loved Sabriel, and I'm excited to see it's a series, and I think I'm gonna pick it up from here. Damn, I wish I had picked this up sooner. If I had read this when I was the proper age, it would have been one of the ones that I am just hitting the bell with, just constantly preaching, because it would have been like foundational to what I look for. But as it is right now, I am just gonna say, yeah, Garth Nix, worth the hype. Just a masterclass of this pen game, able to make you even forget that you're reading and just get lost in the story like few others can. And I'm really excited to read more Garth Nix in the future, even outside of, I think it's the Old Kingdoms series. Yeah, the Old Kingdoms series. Drop the plural. Let me know what Garth Nix writing I should check out, because I have been missing out. I know pen game is used to like talk about rappers, but I think it applies here, except instead of like deep metaphors and lyrics, I'm looking for an author whose pen game is able to make me essentially forget that I'm reading. And there's probably like 5 or 6 authors who have consistently done that with like every book I've picked up for them. And I'm hoping whatever y'all recommend next from Garth Nix just continues that trend. That'd be a good video to make. I might do that. Like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Well done.